history, which I want to spend a little time on, and we can just talk about this and link it into kind of more contemporary stuff, as on December 18th, 1972, the Christmas bombings began. So this is our link to Christmas. This is our Christmas episode. So why not talk about mayhem, destruction, and bloodshed? The Christmas bombings was one of the final, kind of in many ways, the final act of the Vietnam War in terms of the actual conflict. There's a long background to it. What was it, this year? Oh yeah, early this year we
It was the
did
50th anniversary.
and we did with Nome, right? Didn't we? We talked to Nome, and then we did one on our own, I believe.
Yeah.
We have two shows on that. We'll put it in the show notes. This also is connected to that. I don't want to go and repeat the whole long story because it's directly connected to the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, but usually not in the way that most people suggest. Most people give Nixon credit, right? That whole, like with Kissinger, right? They're strategic, they're realist, and all this kind of stuff. But the real story, which I'm going to try to be brief on, is that in the fall of 1972, with Nixon's reelection coming up, he wanted to get out of Vietnam. He wanted that out of the way, thinking it would harm him because the war was very unpopular. And so he and Kissinger kind of reinvigorated peace talks and put new proposals together. And in turn, the northern Vietnamese, Le Duc Tho, made a proposal which basically Kissinger and Nixon more or less accepted the outline of it. But then Nguyen Van Tu from southern Vietnam issued what he called four no's, and he scuttled it. And at that point, Nixon, this is in October, not long before the election, Nixon at that point realizes that he's going to win the election no matter what. So he does a flip, and they turn on Le Duc Tho and the Northern Vietnamese, even though Northern Vietnamese have been negotiating in good faith and making proposals and concessions and just the basic stuff. But obviously, they're winning the war. So all the negotiations proposals were based on what would be best for them, because that's the way the war works, right? You win the war, you get to do that. And in turn, Nixon and Kissinger flipped. Kissinger called the Northern Vietnamese tawdry, filthy shits. And then on December 8th, as the talks broke down between the United States and the Northern Vietnamese, Nixon unleashed the most intense bombing, sustained and brief bombing campaign of the entire war. It was codenamed Operation Linebacker 2. Operation Linebacker was the massive bombing of 1972. This is Linebacker 2. But they became known as the Christmas bombings. They lasted 11 days between the 18th and the 29th. It was devastating in terms of the destruction it created. The U.S. sent fighter jets, F-105s, F-4s, F-111s, over 200 B-52 bombers. And B-52s are massive. They can saturate an area in 2 square miles with one load, one sortie. One of Kissinger's aides, Roger Morris, called it calculated barbarism.
Mm-hmm.
And Morris and was it Tony Lake resigned?
Tony Lake resigned, yeah.
And Roger Morris resigned.
Tony Lake later became Bill Clinton's national security advisor.
Yeah, that's right. But Air Force tactical aircraft threw over 1,000 sorties. This is in 11 days. And B-52s, another 750. They dropped over 40,000 tons of bombs. They hit military targets. They hit the residential areas. They hit the DRVN's biggest hospital and destroyed it. They left craters with diameters of 50 feet. It was a massive level of destruction, and at a great cost. The physical destruction of North Vietnam was, it's there. It was visible and evident. But, and the American media focused on that, how much destruction that the U.S. had caused in the Christmas bombings. And then after that, the negotiations picked back up. And then just a few weeks later, in early, January 23rd or something, like 22nd, 23rd, a peace agreement was reached. So it happened very quickly. That wasn't because the Northern Vietnamese were bombed into submission. It was actually because the bombing had gone so badly for the United States. The conventional wisdom was just on its ear, right? Nixon was attacked globally. The Pope attacked him, and Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, I believe, compared it to Nazi atrocities. And just, it was condemnation all across the world. In addition to that, the U.S. admitted 15 B-52s had been shot down. Northern Vietnamese had Russian surface-to-air missiles, which were quite effective. The Northern Vietnamese claimed that they had shot down 34 B-52s. That's a huge cost, 15 or 34, either way. That's a massive cost, right? You lose 15 B-52s in 11 days. That's pretty intense. So along with the condemnation and the losses, the United States had to finally end the war. This also turned Americans against the war, like in Congress, even you had both in the Senate and House now. You had votes against the Vietnam War. And it's important to understand in terms of history, but I think it also has a couple other virtues talking about this. One is obviously that the conventional story that we often hear, the conventional narrative is skewed to satisfy ruling class interests. It becomes that Nixon, and the liberal media hates Nixon, but at the same time, Nixon bombed Vietnam into submission.
The madman,
The
Richard Nixon.
madman theory, because that was Kissinger, right? He would say, hey, I want to negotiate with you. I'm reasonable, but this guy Nixon's a madman. I can't control him. He's going to blow the world up. So that's, I think, really important. It really had little military purpose. Politically, it backfired. Even Nixon understood at that point the war had to end, and they ended up with a deal in January of 73 that they probably could have had 4 years earlier. It wasn't much different than the proposals that had been floating around for quite some time. The second reason I think it's important to talk about this is because we're seeing like a Vietnam today. And I think what we're seeing in Gaza, which everybody, because of social media, I think to a large degree, we're seeing it like immediate, and we're seeing it in its most graphic form. Like in Vietnam, you have a couple like searing images that like will always be powerful, right? Like the little girl with the napalm scars all over, and the police chief alone killing the guy, the Viet Cong guy, shooting him in the head.
During Tet.
Yeah, during Tet, right? So you have some images like that. We're getting multiple images like that every day now out of Gaza. And I think it's important to understand this is not, it's horrific. It's the worst thing I've seen in a long time. But this is what the US did in Vietnam. And the Christmas bombings is a good example of that, because I've been reading all these legitimate outrage, justifiable outrage, necessary outrage over like bombing a hospital or bombing a refugee camp or whatever. That's the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Or killing people in mosques and churches.
Yeah. Yeah. The hospitals, right? The United States destroyed the biggest hospital in Hanoi.
Yeah.
It just blew it up, right? The Vietnamese, Vietnam had a significant advantage over Gaza. It's a big country. You can get people in and out. There's places for them to hide. Hanoi had been cleared out pretty well by the time the United States bombs were there, but still, it created immense destruction. Hospitals, schools. The U.S. fought that kind of a war. A famous general named Telford Taylor, who had been a prosecutor at Nuremberg, wrote a book in the 70s called Nuremberg in Vietnam, where he talked about America's war crimes and America's atrocities. And I think now, and I'm not suggesting in any way to downplay what's happening in Gaza, but I think it's useful to understand this is not rare. It's not one of a kind, right? This is the way empires act. And the United States is culpable for both, right? The United States is culpable in Vietnam. It essentially invented South Vietnam. It sent gazillions of dollars there in terms of aid and weapons, and it essentially their currency. It controlled everything, right? And the war would have ended in the early 60s. I don't think anybody would doubt that, just because the situation was so bad. That war was about to end just because the Southern regime couldn't sustain itself any longer. But Kennedy was going to get out, right? You knew that was coming. You knew that was coming, right? I
was waiting. Ba-boom, ba-boom.
Ba-boom, yeah. And so the United States was responsible. The United States created just incredible mayhem. It dropped 4.6 million tons of bombs, killed maybe 3 million Vietnamese total. Majority
more than was dropped on Germany and Japan in the whole of World War II
combined. Actually, it killed maybe 2-3 million people. The majority of them were civilian. Created 15,000 refugees, left tons of unexploded bombs. In Laos alone, the United States dropped, 80 million cluster bombs, and 30% never detonated. We had a show on that a couple of years ago from Legacies of War. So
it's still being cleaned up. I personally traveled to the Plain of Jars, which is one of the main places that were bombed, and you're not allowed to go off these very specified trails because the cluster bombs are so embedded in everything around there.
Yeah, every year we're still seeing a significant number of kids, especially, killed in places like Laos and Cambodia. They see it, they think it's a baseball, they think it's a toy or something like that. And I think as we see what's happening today in Gaza, it's obviously important to call them out, to expose what they're doing. But I think it's also important to understand that it's not that easy to make a moral appeal and to condemn people and make them look bad, because they don't really care. The United States was condemned. The Christmas bombings, Olaf Palme comparing it to the Nazis, and Mao and Brezhnev are attacking the U.S. and Western Europeans are attacking the U.S. And they didn't care, you know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I remember during the Clinton years that the Clinton administration was always afraid of being cast as some sort of warmonger, don't want to get pulled into another quagmire, like when we talked about like former Yugoslavia and things like that. But like Obama, Bush and Obama, and then Trump and Biden, it's all changed. They just don't give a shit. It's like Obama just drones and kills anyone who got in their way. And Biden is just like pouring huge chunks of money into Israel and into Ukraine, which is actually one of the interesting things to me about Gaza, but I also think this applies to Ukraine, is it's actually a war that's being played out on social media. Like when we talked about Desert Storm in 91, and we talked about the Iraq War in 2003, those were definitely wars that played out in the media, like CNN and the 24-hour news cycle and stuff. But with these two current conflicts, we're seeing it play out on social media. I can't, it's probably also because of who I follow and what the algorithm sends to me, but I don't look at some of my social media feeds without seeing like horrific pictures of children being pulled out of rubble and children dying in hospitals and things like that. And that's, if think about it, if that had happened in 1972, what would that have done? That Nixon and Kissinger's narrative would have been a lot harder to sustain.
Yeah. Yeah, clearly, yeah. If there had been Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff in the early 60s, Vietnam would have been. But at the same time, and I'm not denying that people need to resist this, but I think Vietnam is instructive in showing just what they're willing to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to understand. I don't know. I have these really horrific ideas about how things in Gaza are going to end, because if you study the United States and American interventions and American empire and American wars, they always end the same way, with just immense bloodshed and destruction. And at the end of the Vietnam War in 1973, you started hearing people talk about the Vietnam syndrome, right?
Mm-hmm.
The United States won't be doing this anymore because we've learned our lesson and we've seen the limits of our power and all that. And that really didn't last. Really.
No, not at all.
We've talked a lot. Jimmy Carter was a highly interventionist president. Today, like I've been thinking about that, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, as I see these like images which just pop up literally like every minute. And I've been thinking a lot more about Vietnam, which I obviously know way more about the history of the Vietnam War than I do about the Middle East. But I know enough about the Middle East to see this pattern here. And I think in many ways that makes the problem, because a lot of people want to turn this into a problem about religion, Islam, Jewish people, Christians, and all that kind of stuff, or about a class of civilizations or all that kind of thing. But it's really, at the end of the day, you have an empire and a colony, an occupying force and a colony. And occupiers are bloodthirsty bastards. Go through what the Europeans did in the Congo and in India, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, what the U.S. has done all over.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I would like to think that if Biden's reelection right now is this like beyond being in the toilet, it's flushed. And, you know,
the 18 to 29-year-olds, which has been the key part of Biden's coalition in the last 3 election cycles, we've said this before, now trending towards Trump, which is unreal.
No,
it's unreal. And I know there's a whole bunch of liberals that we're friends with who are like, think about the Supreme Court. And clearly people are taking that into account and this is still happening.
Yeah. And look at how well it worked out with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Having her on the court was great. Really glad she stayed on as long as she did too. And no, it's mystifying, right? And Biden's numbers have been underwater for a long time, but they weren't, like, he and Trump were really pretty close. But since October 7th or October 8th, they've been in free fall. And the biggest reason for that, and the New York Times Siena College poll came out, I think today, which has the numbers even worse. That's the one that shows 18 to 29-year-olds are now trending to Trump. But just in general, the entire country is opposed to what's happening. You have significant opposition to the U.S. support of Netanyahu pretty much everywhere, in every group, right? Biden's support of Israel is dragging him down, and especially among the groups that put him over the top in 2020, young voters, non-white voters, African Americans, and
Arab Americans in particular.
Arab Americans, forget it, man. He was at what, 60 or 70%, now down to like 17. You have AIPAC going after Democratic
Progressives.
representatives
Yeah.
who are sympathetic for Palestine, right? So I don't see how the Democratic Party digs out of this hole. And they keep shoving them down your throat. The worse things get. The guy is basically politically, he's stage 4, metastatic, right? But they keep trotting him out there. And that was, I think, LBJ in 1968 understood what Vietnam was doing to him.
Yeah.
And his prospects weren't nearly as bad as Biden's. I think LBJ, his whole life wanted to run against Nixon. It's really, apparently he regretted dropping out after that because he always said he would have beat Nixon. It probably would have. He was a brilliant politician.
Yeah.
LBJ was as good as any I've studied. But anyway, I don't know, just like talking about the Christmas bombings. Oh, God.
The only other thing I want to say about the flailing of Biden's coalition and support is we're also seeing where the United Auto Workers have come out and called for a ceasefire. Sean Fain last week actually held a rally with Rashida Tlaib. I actually didn't know this until recently. Rashida Tlaib's dad was actually an auto worker in Dearborn who was a UAW member.
Yeah.
And Michigan, forget about it. Like that was like key to beating Trump in 2020.
Trump's ahead by 8 points in Michigan or something. It says a lot about America. It's scary. It's terrifying, right? That Trump could have this kind of support. That's terrifying. It is, and I concede that. But at some point,
we're in the same space as Trump as we are on Putin. He's a monster, and I guess we have to say it every time because we don't want Trump reelected. But still,
it's easy to sit around and talk about how horrible Trump voters are, and a lot of them they're just unreachable. A lot of people are unhappy with him, and the polls show that. There's no real, like, other than that crazy base of Trump people, which isn't insignificant, but Trump doesn't have enough support among the crazy base to win an election. There are other Republicans, the Chris Christie, Nikki Haley types, who aren't quite as far out there, but the Democrats are giving him nothing. They're giving him nothing. And now, in fact, you have not just the support of, you have a war in Ukraine that's flailing. We are now on the bizarre, surreal, bizarre world of being on the same side as like these crazy right-wing Republicans who oppose the war in Ukraine and want to cut off funding. It's insane, right?
Yeah.
He's on the wrong side in Gaza. He's now basically thrown in the towel on immigration, and he's going to accept all of the Trump policies. And you have liberals like Fetterman in Pennsylvania following suit. Mm-hmm. You have Democrats throughout places like New York who are heavily surveilling. They're involved in heavy surveillance of anti-protest groups against Israel. Everybody is anti-Semitic. That's the other thing, being like everybody's anti-Semitic today or this and that. That was Vietnam, especially in the early stages. If you opposed the Vietnam War, right, you were a communist sympathizer, you were sympathizing with terrorists. The descriptions too, and this is really telling, I think, and worth studying, the descriptions of the Viet Cong, especially earlier on, were just like what you're hearing about Hamas today, right? It's a terrorist group, and we can't negotiate with terrorists and all that kind of stuff. And the Viet Cong, a lot of lefties and liberals ended up lionizing the VC. But today, every time, that's the fucking Zionist basic response, right? Anytime you say something, they blew up a hospital, but Hamas. They killed a bunch of little kids, but Hamas, right? They blew up a refugee camp, Hamas, right? And it's just really, I've never really believed that history could teach us much because people don't learn from their mistakes, right? And, we study history. We don't. No one learns from it. If we all get divorced multiple times, right? We don't learn from our mistakes. Some of us do.
Your history, so you just keep marching into doing the same thing that they did 50 years ago.
Yeah, and yet, as I study, and I don't want to make too much out of this, but as I follow every day these horribly gripping stories coming out of Gaza, these just horrific, they just remind me so much of the United States and Vietnam, right? The United States committed atrocities on a regular basis, not just My Lai, but what was it, the Tiger Force, and just countless instances like that. The kinds of stories we're hearing and seeing in Gaza today aren't that different than what the United States was doing in Vietnam. So I guess,
or really for them at Iraq and Afghanistan,
anywhere,
20
right?
years ago.
No, anywhere, right? And Ukraine too. Ukraine is also a bloodbath, right? And the thing is, in Ukraine, I want the war to end just because it's a bloodbath, right? Not out of any support for Russia whatsoever. Gaza's a little different. It's a bloodbath, and I want it to end. But you can't doubt the aspirations of the Palestinian people and what they've been through. And so I'm not going to sit around. It's obligatory. You have to condemn Hamas. Nobody gives a shit if I say anything about Hamas. Netanyahu, Hamas itself, nobody cares. Doesn't matter what we say about Hamas, right? And that's a slick game. You're not condemning Hamas. You're anti-Semitic. You're said from the river to the sea. You're all this kind of shit. And in Vietnam, it is ironic though, isn't it? Right? That in the United States, you will suffer graver consequences for attacking and criticizing Israel than you do for the United States, right? There are
Mm-hmm.
freaking laws that say you're not allowed to advocate a boycott of Israel, right? That's the US Constitution won't allow that.
Yeah.
So it's insane. But the Vietnam legacy right now is, I've been thinking about it a lot because the outcome of that wasn't great, obviously. Millions of people dead, just the country devastated, destroyed, ecocide. And that's the thing. At least in Vietnam or in Ukraine, it's a kind of a big country and people can move around and get away. And there's a level of autonomy. Whereas the Viet Cong, they had the support of an independent of northern Vietnam, not only northern China and Russia as well, but northern Vietnam. Gaza doesn't have anything like that. Gaza exists inside this brutal occupying state of
Yeah.
Israel.
Yeah.
And you have really nowhere to go. You're on the border of a country that doesn't want you. You have the sea next to you. Hopefully, wiser heads will prevail. I would like, if I saw Biden, among the many things I would tell him is, why don't you do what LBJ did in 1968?
Yeah. Go.
Stay home, drop out of the race. Don't run your vice president, though. That would be probably even worse. The only thing also to point